Kind of looks like the drone in this footage just packed it in, called it a day, and accepted its fate. It's a Tor surface-to-air missile firing there, and the drone just pans out, no evasive maneuvers at all. Gets lucky, but at the end of the day, guess it worked out. So I believe that is a Russian Tor firing at a Ukrainian drone. The reason I say that is just based off the channels this was uploaded on, but the roles could easily be reversed. Both Ukraine and Russia are operating the Tor short to medium surface-to-air missile system, as well as, of course, drones all across the battlefield. It does bring into question, or at least raise the question about the effectiveness of a lot of these missiles against some of these smaller drones. So, most of these, like the Tor, were designed to take out things like ballistic missiles, helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft, which are pretty big targets, especially when compared to the size of some of these drones. The one recording here could be no bigger than, a shoebox or two. So most of these missiles being fired out of surface-to-air systems are pretty big. The one from the Tor is around 9 feet long. So it's a lot different trying to hit a small drone than it is a large helicopter trying to move by. They mitigate that by utilizing proximity fuses. So rather than the missile actually having to strike the target directly, it detonates in the general proximity, which should bring down whatever it is they're firing at. So, impossible to tell based off what we're seeing here if the proximity fuse just didn't detonate, if it detonated late, or if something else happened entirely. All right, today we've got videos of Russia laying off-route anti-tank mines, a pretty unique RPG being used in the Myanmar civil war, Wagner training forces up in Belarus, and a remote EOD platform now being used in Ukraine. This is a video put out by the Russian Ministry of Defense showing some of their soldiers under thermals emplacing some anti-tank mines somewhere along the front. So there's a bunch of areas where the tactic is just to scatter mines, blanket an area as many as possible. But then there are others, specific areas of the front, choke points, for instance, where the mines are more set one by one, kind of like you're seeing here. And I'll pause it real quick. I'm pretty sure what you're seeing here is a TM-83 mine, which is it's old Soviet mine actually, but it's an off-route shaped charged anti-tank mine. And the way these things work is that rather than most landmines being placed on the actual route and you want the vehicle to drive over it before it detonates, an off-route mine is set off to the side of the route. So it's pointed at the area where you think the vehicles will be driving through. The way this one can be triggered is either seismic or infrared. So usually they'll be set to seismic, and then when they pick up a vehicle approaching, they'll switch over to infrared. And there's an infrared beam that goes out, and when that beam is broken, the mine deploys, firing a shaped charge into the side of the vehicle. Landmine emplacement, or IED emplacement, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, and a bunch of other places, has always reminded me a lot of hunting, right? It's a matter of kind of predicting where someone or something is going to move through and getting things set up ahead of time to interdict that movement, to ambush them, in a sense. If you're hunting, you want to set up that blind or a tree stand in an area where the deer aren't going to see you. They're going to get used to walking through this area safely, or maybe they're focused on the trail ahead or the food source in front of them, and you're able to cut some shooting lanes and set up a blind or a stand off to the side just out of their vision to where they move through it without even thinking twice. And really the same applies to very effective landmine and IED emplacement in a war zone. You want to put these things in places that aren't super obvious, where the enemy might be distracted doing something else. Either they're pinned down by direct or indirect fire, or they're looking at the landmines that they know are right in front of them. So they've slowed their pace, and meanwhile, off route, you've got something like this TM-83 ready to engage from the side. Got an interesting one here. So these are a couple guys from the People's Defense Forces in Myanmar firing DZGI-40s, which are bounding anti-personnel rockets. So the way these work is they're fired from a 75mm rocket launcher, and when they hit the ground, they bounce up in the air to a height of 3 meters, at which point between 800 and 900 steel balls are scattered out in every direction, kind of like a claymore, firing in every direction. It ends up having a lethal blast radius of about 15 meters. Now, I'm sure there is a ton of variation on how that works out. If the rocket lands into a downslope or on concrete versus grass or whatever, but that's the idea. Kind of a unique Chinese munition that turns a rocket into a claymore when it lands. Now, the Myanmar civil war has been going on since 2021. There's not a lot of coverage of it, I'd say, overall, especially with more and more of the focus turning to the war in Ukraine. Now, it's been pretty deadly. There's an estimated 30,000 plus people have been killed since the war began, with another 1 million being displaced. So it's, one of the major conflicts going on in the world to this day. This is a video put out by Belarusian state TV, supposedly showing Wagner fighters training the National Guard or Territorial Defense Forces in Belarus, which, look, pretty good deal for Belarus, all things considered. So there's been a lot of debate since the kind of coup that fell apart, mutiny, whatever we're going to call it, in June, as to where Wagner's going to end up. And one of the arguments is that they're going to go to Belarus and do something just like this, train the Belarusian military or police forces. And look, if you take a look at how the Russian military has performed in Ukraine, there's one element that stands out, and it's Wagner, in that they have been the most adaptable and versatile force really on the battlefield. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of the main ones is they're not tied up in the bureaucracy of the Russian Ministry of Defense, or at least they weren't previously. That allowed Wagner elements to adapt much faster to conditions on the battlefield, and kind of, I don't necessarily want to say bottom up, but lower level commanders were able to kind of implement changes in the tactics of how Wagner was fighting, specifically around Bakhmut. Now, that said, there were also some pretty brutal means that Wagner was fighting, integrating in a lot of the prisoners that had a relatively short lifespan in Bakhmut over the last year or so. But Wagner's not entirely prisoners. They have a mixed bag. Some prisoners and some are relatively professional soldiers now with significant combat experience. So if you think about this from the point of view of anyone in Belarus trying to get some combat experience, maybe not combat experience, but to be able to translate some of that combat experience into training for their military, Wagner's not a bad place to look for Belarus, right? They're going to have limited options as to who can come into their country and train their forces. But Wagner's probably going to be able to hand off a lot of gained knowledge from the battlefields in Ukraine, and a lot more usable type information than would maybe come through the Russian Ministry of Defense. So this is the GCS-200, which is a remotely operated EOD platform now being utilized in Ukraine. So I think it was back in December 2022, Germany gave 3 of these to Ukraine to help them really demine major areas all across the country. If you look at those kind of things hanging in the front there, those are the flails. The way that works is those will start to spin around and chew into the earth, and they'll kick up and detonate any anti-tank or anti-personnel landmines. Now, this is an interesting platform because it's remotely operated, right? There's no people at risk during the demining operations, and it's relatively protected. It has enough armor to protect against small arms, but not going to do much against RPGs or anti-tank guided missiles or fixed or rotary wing aircraft, but it is a step in the right direction. Now, the platform also comes with, that connection on the front with the flail. It also has a tiller to kind of dig through the earth, a claw, and a forklift as well. So it's a pretty robust EOD type platform. And I think I read that it can clear up to 12,000 square meters in a day. It's pretty slow, only going at a couple kilometers an hour. But again, it's a remote EOD platform, not putting a person's life at risk. And it is designed to be used a little more towards the front, right? This isn't entirely designated as a civilian demining platform like is happening in Ukraine. There's a bunch of areas all across the country, like the tip of the spear folks. They're doing a lot of demining in areas where they're not necessarily getting shot at. The GCS-200 is designed to be used a little more towards the front. This is going to be a little closer to a hostile type environment. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. If interested, the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.